and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the Man at YouTube with another Honing Your Airbrush Skills video. The acoustics and background is a bit different as this is a temporary workspace at my new property, which will be converted outside in a shop workshop. As this is going to be a bit unusual and I'm decommissioning the old workshop, we're going to look at some different equipment that is fairly popular on my YouTube channel, especially the small 12-volt compressors. We're going to push it to its limit, see what we can do, if it's a decent purchase or not, and clear some misconceptions, as well as another model of extractor booths that you see very commonly on Amazon and eBay fairly cheaply. A bit of a disclaimer about the Honing Your Airbrush Skills videos. It is somewhat of a vlog of me learning and exploring, experimenting with my airbrush and sharing what I pick up through practice and monthly regular use to keep my skills relevant, up to date and refreshed, as well as demonstrating stuff in a long-winded sense that you will not get from a shortened tutorial or video series. So none of it is the perfect way or the best approach to pulling off these techniques or airbrushing in general, but just my take and current thought process. They can become a bit outdated over time as I learn and pick up new skills. Plus, other modelers and artists have different approaches and different outlooks or preferences to brands, use methods, settings and whatnot. Now, from my personal point of view, I find using larger needles and nozzles far more easier to put through paint rather than ink or artistic supplies, 0.5 mil water trap underneath. And I also am a big fan and regularly use these 12-volt compressors where you may not necessarily see the PSI or the dial, but you can still adjust the air. Let's have a closer look. This is the Royal Max 12-volt compressor, probably the best one I reviewed out of a bunch bought off online. This one was purchased 1 year later than the initial one I bought, which also works quite well. It's for a friend who he eventually returned to me. We have the bleed here, the output, and what's important to notice when you're storing these and stop using it is they build up moisture in it very easily, and being purely plastic components, if anything malfunctions or breaks, this is the end of the life of your compressor. I've not known anyone to repair the rings or anything else, even though if you have dismantled them. Plus, these are able to cut out due to overheating with a thermo switch inside. Allowing it to overheat too often will also cease it from working any further. The best way to overcome this is to make sure there's no air captured in the chamber, and after use bleed all the air out, and I find the easiest way is just overall removing the hose and allowing any moisture inside to completely evaporate and become dry. This is the storage state that this compressor should be in at all times when you're not using it. We also have the 0.3 Mr. Hobby Procon airbrush, an airbrush that I do not regularly use, but eventually given to me by Atomize after it has shut down. The braided hose has been connected to the two, and you're able to turn it on immediately with a constant airflow, about 9 to 11 psi, sufficient for painting indeed. When you put it down to change paint, clean it out or wait, that's when you push it to turn off. You will be rapidly turning it on and off quite regularly, which can wear out the button, but the only serviceable components to these airbrushes, compressors, is the button. That can be electrically switched if you're constantly turning it on and off. As we've turned it off, it is still holding air, and before we're allowed to turn it on, which will wear out the pistons, we need to drain all the air out before we're able to turn it on. Now, once we turn it on, we wait a few seconds, it's completely charged up and we're spraying. If you wish it to be a lot more gentle, you're doing some very fine detailing, highlighting, whatnot, this is the bleed that you're able to open. And what it actually does to lower the PSI is leak air out, so it sprays at a much distant or delicate rate. It's not very easy to control, but it's something that you have access to, as well as a form of bleeding out any moisture or air that's trapped inside, or just permanently leaving it open if you are known to be bad for maintaining these sort of things and preventing damage. That is all the controls that is available to this very basic airbrush, but generally very good to get your feet wet if you're a beginner. In my case, a spare airbrush compressor in case my main one packs up, I'm traveling, or I have to have a temporary workspace. And this is the mains power LED extractor booth. There's not much to this, it's very basic. 12 volt fan, plugs into mains power, an LED rack which is eventually burnt out. You find this generally under $100 US. The whole assembly closes into a suitcase, which is also portable if you're spraying on the go with one of these smaller rigs. You will notice that we are indoors inside a house and not an annexed workshop, shed or atrium. Fumes are going to build up in here very easily. If you live with people, you're a dependent child, or you're a partner to a husband or wife, it is highly inappropriate to use lacquers. They will seep and smell into the rest of the house. You will also notice that I'm up against the window. I can open it, I can vent out. There's still residual fumes that will stink out the place, and you need to be considerate of people that you're living with. This is where you'll consider and wish to spray a polyurethane or an alcohol based paint if this is your only revenue of spraying indoors. Soon this will all be shipped outside, but wearing a mask inside will only protect you, it'll only vent out. Everybody else is going to suffer. Lucky for me, I live here by myself, so it doesn't matter that much. In this example you're going to see in the video, I am utilizing a budget thinner. I mentioned it multiple times, has to be of a lacquer base, not alcohol, definitely not oil or enamel. I'm using multi-purpose thinner in a smaller bottle, which is used for everything from thinning your hobby lacquer paints, cleaning out your airbrush, wiping everything down, and I'm going to be thinning with it later on. In this footage is an example of good use in operating this compressor. I'm only turning the button on as I'm spraying, so when it's not spraying and building up power or air, that is just only happening for a limited amount of time as to not overheat. About 10 minutes of constant use, and it's going to thermo out and in the future burn out. Rapidly turning it on and off, you can extend this period to go on for hours and hours of spraying, as the majority of the time is used in prepping, cleaning, tearing down, mixing paints, thinning and adding, and not necessarily the spraying proportion itself. I've just put a little bit of Tamiya already pre-thinned primer into the airbrush, and touched up my YF Resin 19 Valkyrie in some spots that has formed cracks and pits that I've covered in putty, sanded it and resprayed to see if there's any faults and do I need to do any further work, which it's popped out quite nicely so far. I get a lot of questions in the comment section of, can this airbrush and compressor combination do this hobby, that hobby, makeup, cake decoration, painting shoes, painting nails, painting any sort of object whatsoever? And realistically, it's just a tool, and tools are marketed for niche groups to put a brand and sell it for a top brand to that community or consumable amount of people. What I'm doing here is I've just sourced this tool from China and putting a broad blanket out there that you can acquire it as cheap as humanly possible and utilize it to your own ability. If you're able to thin the material and medium down, pour it in there and spray it out as an output. So the answer to that question will always be yes. It's going to suit your need within your specifications on the outline that the output and the coverage area is enough. This is approximately about 15 by 15 centimeters, and we can see about how quickly with an even spray we're able to cover a transparent coating in a quarter of the whole surface area, and in a small area we sprayed enough paint where it's a solid color change from the background. So it's going to take a little longer than a larger horsepower compressor, but in the end and for the price it's going to complete the job no matter what. It goes down to also PSI and pressure control. Can you gauge and control the pressure? Answer is yes and no. Yes, you can adjust the pressure via the bleed valve on the side here. I've drew up a piece of paper and I'm doing a fat line, a thin line and a tiny line and opening it and adjusting it. At full pelt we're able to colour in and put the maximum amount of paint with a very soft feathered edge. As you open it to 30 to 50%, there's less pressure and you can paint far finer lines and have more control and do fine detail work. But shading is a problem and colouring in is a problem. Opening it up completely past 50% to 100% is practically useless, and you're not going to have enough pressure going through for the consistency of paint. If you're putting other mediums in there such as water or inks, that's going to apply for you. And whenever you get any of these tools, you experiment by continuously painting lines and pushing it to the limits to see what it does with the medium that you work with. But also consider heavily that the condition of the tool attached to the compressor is also very important in cleanliness and nozzle diameter. This is a 0.3, 0.5 works perfectly, and if you're doing paint, I would highly recommend updating to that as maintenance is so much easier. This showcase is showing the control, the versatility and how artistically fine you can be with this product. I've got a 70-second tank. It's about 10 centimeters or so in length and it's a very detailed trumpeter. The 70-second Type 94 Imperial tank, not Imperial, Cold War tank. It's very rich in detail and there could be all sorts of clipping with paint. I'm using a light blue on top of a very dark blue, and I initially test out the pressure and lowered it to about 30%, where I was able to get quite a nice feathered effect around the wheel realms, and then colour in the top and shade downwards. I found the control to be quite adequate for this size, and realistically it did a pretty damn good job. I can't lie that it worked quite well out of a sufficient light source, and it was just no stress what to use, even though I don't have access to an air tank. It's just applying with the pressure you have and thinning the paint and dropping the pressure to the point where you can have an output of paint that's not spluttery but very fine. Gradients are a lot harder to pull off. You're not going to get it straight away. Sometimes it takes a few years to achieve, and if you have this product, you probably may or may not have, depending on your conditions and your airbrush, will get the same result. But with practice and time, you're able to do it with your preferred rig, and then carrying on with how it feels to get an ideal gradient spray out of your airbrush. You're able to tune and play with whatever you sit at and pull the same thing off. And yes, even with the cheapest airbrushes, the cheapest nozzles, and the tiny plastic compressor that's normally scoffed among many. In the event you're getting any spluttering or faults, low flow, not a desirable amount of paint coming out. Take the needle out, clean the tip and check for bends. Also remove the nozzle and check for any rubbish that may be stuck inside, and there's plenty of clearance between the cap and the nozzle if you were to change a nozzle. Any tears and the replacement of parts as necessary. Scrub out quite nicely, and at the end of the session obviously we'll dismantle the whole airbrush. Let's do something a little bit more ridiculous just for fun and purely because I like to play with different tools and toys. This is a wireless airbrush. The battery and the compressor is built in this tiny thing. You can definitely guarantee there is absolutely no air tank and minimal pressure. Though there is enough air coming out to make a difference when it comes to spraying paint and mediums. Also a 0.3 mil needle and nozzle, utilizing a very cheap Chinese manufactured aluminium airbrush. This little guy has the most minimum of control, and instead of leaking air in and out or even having the ability to trigger air up and down, this is a double action converted to a single action. I can push the button, I have to rock backwards and forwards to how much pressure I've got, and I pull back and start moving around. And it's only really good for colouring in. It's actually very hard to control and get gradients, but it's actually kind of possible if you play around with it much. So it doesn't matter how primitive your setup is, turning it on and off to save power obviously, it doesn't matter how primitive your setup is, you can actually get the result. And I remember reading hobby magazines from 10 to 20 years ago where they were getting amazing pre and post shade effects out of single action airbrushes and compressed cans of air. You'll notice that I'm mad enough that I'm happy to rock it backwards and forwards and utilize it on a kit that I'm actually building and painting for a finish review. Going onto the piece of paper for painting lines, we cannot get too much of a suitable line, but we can do fairly primitive soft edge camouflage and definitely medium surface blushing and shading. Not a complete useless tool, just primitive, a bit of a novelty, and awesome when it's portable or touching up or on the go with no power sources. The rest of the video will focus on the 12 volt, more superior mains bleed off model. These do need charging, but the most frustrating bit is they're the slowest and most inconvenient systems to clean out and change paint. However, what I have done with these before, attach it to a power bank and you can spray for absolute hours when modelling away from any source of power. That and these take up no space if you're travelling with only a toolkit and modelling somewhere that only requires a backpack or a car trunk. A little bit tricky, but we're using the reference material on the side of the box as loosely as possible. We've got one side, the back and the front. On the other side of the tank we have the top. Using some test lines on the side of my can of thinner. Very tight pattern, a 0.2 would work best. Used a 0.3. Was able to replicate with a soft edge this pattern all the way around. The thinner ratio is 50-50 paint and thinner Mr. Hobby lacquers. I've gotten really close, and as you saw from painting the top, it's a very slow process. I did the outline of where I wanted the effect to be, and then went back, coloured in from multiple angles to make sure that I've got all the detail coloured in and there's no blue coming through at certain details. The next stage is going to be shading and putting lighter white on top of this cream to lighten up the snow camouflage, which should be able to cover everything else. We open the valve just a crack to soften the lines and the impact of the paint. And going in a downwards motion from the side to the top, we started to shade from the beige colour to the white at the bottom of the wheels, the sides of the tan colour of the camouflage, and colouring in the centre of the tan lines to give it a soft snow effect. The next one we're going to do an actual stark white and only paint from the top to get a light bird's eye shade of snow. It was only a tiny dollop of paint, and you can see how it's intense on the top but far more darker to the side. Quite effective. One of my favourite paints and mediums to give a model a bit of kick, shadowing, definition, realism is liquid black, or also known as liquid smoke in other types. I go for lacquers all the time. The Mr. Colour GX comes in 200ml, so you get double the amount for your bang for your normal hobby jars. And what I've done, as you can see in the running of this video, is tilt the model upside down at a 45-degree angle and dust really lightly a heavy ratio of thinner to paint. And we've got a very soft line on our thinner can and some tight lines. And I'm shadowing in the wheel realm where a natural shadow is. If extra light is blasted in there, it's going to look still very similar. And a bit of a shadow in between the turret and the hull to create a greater darkness. Looking all the way at the top, we've got a fine point and darkened the areas of the vents where fumes and dirt and oils likely to come out, the smokestacks on the sides, just a bit of a lick at the end of the barrel to draw the line, tickling underneath the turret front for a barrel shadow and a turret shadow inside of this little camera mechanism, around the top of the turret hatch, the back, and finally going underneath and just darkening around the wheel well, as well as a darker shade of blue for under where it's very likely to be dark. All of this shading, the freehand camouflage, the shading on top of the camouflage, the liquid black, was all still done with this tiny compressor, all by manipulating the thinner, the distance, and the bleed cap. The black was done with, again, the bleed cap open just by a quarter of a twist. Some months have passed and we've finally moved into the intended place, about 4 or 5 meters in your direction for our final setup. Going to have at least 2 to 3 compressors and 2 extractor booths to maximize our potential. This is getting closer to a commercial or workplace airbrush setup to a hobbyist or amateur semi-professional one that I've previously promoted. Ventilation wise, we have 2 points of contact of a wire mesh door and a large garage door. Both can be opened post the session or during the session to get all the fumes out. We're using one of these standard budget fold out extractor booths and a small 12 volt plastic piston air compressor and a budget airbrush. Larger variety among my collection is going to be on site once this is all finished, though this video will continue on the budget end and the smaller PSI instruments. A lot of people ask if the larger steel ones why they don't reach or sustain or go above 20 PSI, and that's because it's just incapable of forming that much pressure from the air and struggle with heat friction that would normally be far more easily overcome by a larger mains power compressor that's in the realm of 0.5 to 1 and beyond in horsepower, or the consumption of electricity from about 500 to over 1,000 watts. Instead of spending a lot of money, our school of thought is utilize the minimal and get the most out of it. Utilizing not so ideal paint consistency, thinner the higher the PSI, you will potentially push anything out. But adjusting things a little finer, having a better understanding and a better mixture, you're able to work with a much larger selection of pressures and effects, and even work with a smaller limitation of equipment. With all of that out of the way, we're working on a very small project, a M4 Sherman wargaming scale. It's done in a NATO-ish blue-black colour, and we've applied a masking film to get a hard edge camouflage effect. We'll be applying the next coat as the paint has been dried for more than 24 hours. The mask has been dried for 5+ hours. With airbrushing, you also have to consider people you're living with and among, and a lot of people like to set up their airbrush in a bedroom that's connected to the main house, or somewhere in the house where you've pretty much got drafts and gaps in the doors. The fumes will seep, leak and give a nasty headache inducing smell or fume across the place. I've always worked in an area annexed from the main house and do live with other people, even though I am the owner of this property. And as such, as this used to be the front door, the main door and window are sufficiently sealed, and once closed, is it going to cause problems for anybody. With the pandemic that's currently going on in 2020, there was a vast shortage to an immediate major mass availability of various forms of respirators and masks, and it's more important than ever to choose the right one for the job and even do a little research. The M4 masks with a rubber to silica fit around the face and mouth can get an active charcoal or the right filter that can deal with vapors, gases, all that sort of thing that is appropriate when you've got airborne particles from an airbrush of solvents and alcohols. Such a thing as a medical pollen or particle mask is not really ideal unless you are issued or acquired, which I believe is called an N95 mask, which this was actually issued to me by my workplace and government when I was still working. In the way of protection equipment, you don't have to go as far as hazmat or even chemical or military grade stuff. There is a limit where you can buy something that is far too expensive. Just a middle of the mark vapor mask, and not in the end just any excuse to show off some of my cool toys. Never underestimate an excellent airbrush stand and delivery for thinner. I love the little squeeze bottle that I've finally brought back to the new workshop, and a shout out to this new piece that I've been holding on to for a few years from Daryl Williams, famous modelling icon in Melbourne, Australia, and owner of Gundam's Plus model shop. He gifted me this wonderful piece a bit before opening. In the old intermediate setup inside the house, I was using these chemical resistant pipettes, which are not too bad. You can buy a fairly large quantity that's medical grade, which is far cheaper than hobby grade. Probably a very similar product out of the same factory. Because I was talking so much, I forgot if I thinned the paint or not, so I'm swirling it around and I'm seeing it not sticking too much to the side, and that's a pretty good consistency. Being able to see that when you get distracted easily, it's a good skill to know. The effect I'm going for is the original M4 American colour scheme. The olive green is still coming out at the bottom, the wheels, that sort of thing. These tanks were eventually sold to the British Army government, lent, whatever you want to call it, and they repurposed it and painted it for Africa, the desert front. And what they did was they only painted above the wheel tracks the sand colour and a little bit of a blackish blue, blackish green colour stripes to break up the pattern. What I did was, one pass, I did a very careful line outlining the skirt of the tank, not spilling over to the wheels too much, though you will get some overspray. However, being spray guns, the original would have also, it's going to be a decent amount of green. And once that's laid down, I did a second session where I just did a general colour in, but still respecting the green bits. If you're not that confident, you can put a very loose bit of card or masking tape on the wheels to keep that area. It's probably just dry enough to touch, and you can see that the bottom and the front has nothing, so it's got that desired effect. To put this setup under the final and one of the toughest tests, we've moved up to 0.5mm needle and nozzle. What we're going to put through it is Mr. Surfacer 500, very thick microfiller primer, which some people have a lot of issue using just by itself and push for a higher PSI. Using a machine that's 9 to 12 PSI, we're going to run that product through and paint this 3D printed resin piece that I've been doing a few coats to get all the imperfection out and really fill out those nasty scratch marks, putty pits and stepping from the printing process. It's rippled a bit, it's settling, ever so slightly transparent, so 2 coats are required. Applies pretty good in my opinion. Slightly a little more thinned than 50-50. The left leg is a solid 3 to 4 coats. It hasn't pretty much flooded or folded over too much. There's no damage. We've got a very nice consistency, but we have to see it evaporate a bit to see if there is any issues. On the right leg, only the upper thigh above the kneecap, we did 1 coat, so we can still see some marbling where there's a little primer left over and some base material. We're going to continue colouring it in until it's all painted. About 2 coats, maybe a third in some area, and that's a pretty stark white. Best thing you can always do is apply a silver undercoat. Well, this is a colossal fuck up, a bit dejected, but we can fix it. It's not that much of an issue. Keeping the masking on, we have sanded, buffed and polished the issues where the paint pulled and lifted the undercoat, utilising the God hand sponges and polishing components, managed to make it equally flat. I gave all white surfaces 2 coats of the Tamiya flat white over silver, and even though it's flat, it has the most beautiful, almost pearlescent luster, and there's 3 coats of white, 1 coat of silver, sanded silver, and 2 coats of white again in affected areas where we had the damage. This is where it was all messed up, and it looks like it's the original coat of paint. The SMS didn't work out too well, but yeah, this had even pigment coverage. Be interesting filming during the day, but we're painting a husky dog, and we generally want it to be patchy fur. So it's going to be all over the place, starting from a light tone to a very dark tone. I'm going to clip the top of the ears, and it's almost randomized, and it doesn't matter if it's even or not. And do some swirls, and then we just shade a bit of the inside, darken in a few spots, just keep it parallel in wherever you're going, and there you go. That's a lot more interesting looking brown wise. Just finished painting our 3D printed dog, and I've put the final coat of the Premium Clear by Gaianotes, my current favourite clear coat, and it's giving a luster like it's an actual tangible object. I'm going to gloss up the eyes and the metal as soon as I finish filming with a paintbrush. And how I achieved this finish, by looking at a reference picture of Husky, and I just actually happened to have a Soviet gas mask on hand. I started with just a starch white body and tickled a little pink around the pads of the paws and the inner part of the ears, which is practically not even visible. But the accents are important because your eyes and senses automatically recognizes as the right organs to a dog, and started outlining the pattern of the fur with a light medium brown and shading it in a fairly patchy manner across its body, and then going closer and closer to the back with a very dark brown, and then shading the immediate back with a black. The mask we won't talk about too much because that was hand painted. Could not have been bothered masking and doing that up. And for a worn-in detailed look, just played with a little bit of stippling and a couple of washes and brush shades just to make it look like a completely different surface. And it's all popped together quite nicely. In this section we're going to do a little diorama painting for 1/12 scale. Won't finish the whole process in this take, but we're still using the 12-volt compressor, and at a higher output, outright colouring in with the red-brown is not a problem at all. Load it up, fit it 50-50, spray all the way, cleans pretty easy. As we go up the scale of colour tones, shifts, and being a bit playful, we're going to thin it a bit more, and we're moving to a pre-mixed lighter brown. Some areas I'm saturating and outright painting or colouring in raised elevations, and other areas I'm just outlining certain waves and textures that has been sculpted into this diorama with texture paint and sculpting clay, previously seen in another video yet to be released. The texture does pick that out very nice, but it gives the illusion of elevation as there actually is elevation. Again, paint goes in easy, comes out. Moving on to an even lighter brown. We're shading on top of that and being more playful in shading and outlining areas, and a lot less, if none at all, colouring in, pulling back and shading just to lighten everything up, last going to the sand colour. Moving to just an outright black, we're highlighting the areas where the figures are going to be standing. It's definitely going to be shadowed if a little bit of colour does leak out. So it's going to be a black void separating the figure from the model itself and not look like an awkward gap, and shading the very edges to blend into the side base and colouring in the side outright. At this time it's a bit tricky to handle. Moving on to burnt iron, there's a little bit of strange debris in the centre, textured with both texture paint and just some random gunpowder part is coloured in among the dirt and blended due to its similar colour. Moving on to the weathering process, I added a wash product that I had trouble with earlier that I'm going to seal with an acrylic and then matte it down later with a lacquer matte product. We're putting a bit of flock, which will also be sealed by the matte, preventing the flock to separate from the PVA glue. Just a nice fine amount of flock, strategically placing different areas of PVA glue. If you put matte directly on PVA glue, that will frost up. So what's going to happen is an acrylic clear will go on top of that, allow that to sufficiently dry, well, after the glue has hardened, of course. Then the final coat is going to be a lacquer clear. If I put lacquer clear straight over it, it's going to frost in areas and crackle in other areas. We're going to have a barrier between this enamel wash. Recently I had a disaster where the surface crackled from the incorrect use of a wash and a lacquer top coat. This process included after all the washes and PVA glue also reacts negatively to a matte top coat, was all sealed in an acrylic Tamiya clear, a second coat of a Tamiya clear matte, and once 24 hours allowed to dry, finally a lacquer top coat. There is no problems, and after the sheen has been removed and the tone lightened from a very good flat clear Gaianotes premium, we've got all the original tones that we airbrushed and the richness of the texture brought out by the washes, as well as the different follicles of the flock. This is the finished look of my airbrush space on the grand workshop table with 2 setups, and eventually there'll be a third once I dig it up. I've got my OPHIR 0.5 airbrush and the Lowland Pixie compressor, also by OPHIR. So these two compressors, compressor and airbrush, is still working very well, as well as the Royal Max with Mr. Hobby Procon airbrush. At the moment what I've done, and this is a few months without any maintenance work or whatnot, and a few finished models, spraying Mr. Surfacer 500, the very tricky microfiller primer to spray on this 3D printed model to sand, get rid of the Z-axis lines and repaint. It's all working fairly well on the old original Sparmax Extractor booth compared to the cheaper mainland China import one. We'll be finishing up with some maintenance. First we're going to bleed out our little bullet water trap, which is something I probably don't do enough. It was full of water last time. Made sure the tape is all nice and sealed. Thinner may run down, eventually craze it, and the last one melted to the point where there was holes and could not hold a seal anymore. This model is very similar to the Hyacinth. The strip down is not that much different. Pull out of the needle, give that a scrub down. Next component is the needle nut to make sure it goes backwards and forwards. The rest is the needle pushback assembly. It's a very long thread to keep air in there and to be nice and stable. You can see that it's all greased up, though interestingly enough there is very little paint mixed into the grease, so the seal is doing a very good job. To dismantle, there's the sleeve, the spring and the shaft with a tongue. Next we pull out the trigger, which is in there pretty tight, and there is a bit more contaminated grease, so we'll have to clean that out with a Q-tip. We've got the tip, a bit of a build-up of paint, and this seal, which we don't want to break too often, as if anything happens to the O-ring, this airbrush is pretty much trashed. So a little care is taken, though we do want to open it at least a couple of times a year to inspect the quality, put a little grease on it to prevent it from drying out. There's no gunk in there, the holes have not been clogged, and we remove the nozzle to clean out the internals. If the contamination of grease is getting bad enough, we're going to need to put it in a ultrasonic bath like previous videos, but things are still going pretty well. So we're going to Q-tip the internals. Using the rear of the needle, we're going to push it all the way through to see if there's any gunk or junk behind the nozzle. As I've updated to a 0.5 rather than a 0.3, I find that lint does not build up, so we can maintain it a lot less. Cleaning is not required as often, and it's just a quicker and more pleasant experience, especially with primers, microfillers, that sort of thing. My 0.2 and 0.3 mil airbrushes get minimal use regarding fine detail and gradient spraying and whatnot, so maintenance is only really required of them once every few years. Right now I'm just scrubbing down all of the components, removing any grease, any paint, and just polishing them up nicely back to their bare metal state, as to re-grease it and reassemble. The rest of the scrub has occurred. We're going to give the inside a very good scrub with the end of a Q-tip to get any debris out. I've also soaked the nozzle in a bout of thinner, just to make sure that any build-up of paint on the inside or the small bit of nozzle is definitely removed. Now we've got a spring-loaded valve here, an automatic one, and we've got a fine Q-tip, an amazing investment for your art and hobby, and I'm pushing down just to make sure the spring works. The only thing I do not like about this airbrush is this is all enclosed, and to replace or fix you would have to open this assembly with tweezers. This is demonstrated in other Honing Your Airbrush Skills video. Now I am continuing to swab Q-tips in thinner and continuing to swab the inside until eventually I am returned with a clean end. This will take a few goes. Now, to make sure that the nozzle is well cleaned and the tip isn't clogged, the needle is sharpened, not kinked, is to place it over top, and you should have about 1 to 1.5 mil of the needle sticking out. This is in prime condition. You're going to have to stop there. The next maintenance will definitely have to be a bath. Now, the scale modelling hobby will get you ridiculed, laughed at and shamed for choices you make and activities that you recommend or not. It's up to you if you follow it or not, though this is my path and don't really judge either or. Mechanical theory that metal does not work on metal very well regardless of the tolerance, and will grind up against each other, seize and whatnot. In the event that one of these seals fail, and you just get the tiniest amount of paint or dirty thinner flowing through, it's going to stick bits together most definitely. And a little lubricant goes a long way for smooth operation and surviving any paint cross-contamination. Generally the parts here are going to be fully lubricated. Just the threads for this one, half of the back end of the needle, and just this O-ring here to vitalize it a bit from any harsh chemicals going on it before it leaks, as well as the back end. You could use a light machine oil. There are special products out for airbrushing. I just lightly glaze it with Vaseline. So ideally, after doing all that and assembling properly, once you push down, you should have air coming down. If you're having trouble putting the needle in, it's probably because that the brass knob end has not slid down into the valve correctly. Also, you want to make sure that your needle is packed to the end as much as possible, so when we're spraying, you don't want any thinner escaping. We've got thinner inside of here. If we cover for the jet bubble technique, there should be no bubbles when we push down, but when we pull back, it starts to bubble. Putting it in light, there is ever so slight amount of grey colour, so the clean wasn't super thorough, but it's enough for our brush to work successfully. The second amount of tests we're going to do is painting lines on this piece of paper to make sure that it's not spluttering and we've got a fine amount of control. Oh boy, we've got a bit to talk about. So one of the tests I've done is just colouring a piece of plastic, which is the thing that I'm best at doing. There's no spluttering, it's very smooth, sticks on well, doesn't scratch off that easily, it's maintained well. Now what I always recommend at the end of every Honing Your Airbrush Skills video is to practice, train, improve, do this as regularly as possible. It's what I'm going to continue after not doing so for a couple of years. My airbrushing has definitely improved. My point of view and philosophy, beliefs in airbrushing has changed since I've started and starting of this series, especially in relationship to nozzle size, tool size, more importantly, the viscosity of the paint. What I've done here is the first few lines on this wicker compressor is a bit spluttery. It is thick, sort of the consistency of what people like to say of milk. When you slosh paint like water in the glass, the paint will stick, become translucent and fall back into the pot. That's ideal for colouring in. However, if you have it thinner, it soaks and works better on paper than the mixture we're using in the airbrush to go straight onto plastic. As we move on, the gradient is becoming finer and finer, however harder to control as it's becoming thinner. If I was to thin the paint further and swap back to a 0.3, I think it would be a lot easier to do fine lines. And I'm thinking more of doing finer detail, highlights, blushes, fine lines, that sort of thing. It's an aspect I'm playing with at the moment, and might even explore a video where I pull out a range of airbrushes, a range of different thinned paints, slop them straight in and do comparison lines. That's all for the future, but again, a bit of a disclosure, this is just me learning this tool with the rest of you playing and watching at home. You'll only improve by knowing the mechanism, by pulling it apart, putting it back together and mechanically being very intimate with it and regularly having it in hand. Plus how often you use it if you have a very high output of models, and if not so, just experimenting and playing around. This concludes the video, especially during these pandemic lockdown times. I'm starting to look at bigger projects and more activity on the channel. I'll be painting things a little outside my usual very small miniatures of tiny tanks and Gundams. With a 3D printer in the mix, I'm looking at doing much larger models, importing car paint to spray surfaces in much larger diameters and outside the scope of what I already have, and creating art around that. With the laser cutter, I'm also looking at doing a series of finer stencils and incorporating that in models and most likely the larger 3D prints. Again, stay tuned. We'll have a play with all of that, the usual content, and just a touch more. As usual, if you have any questions or require any help or assistance of anything that we're doing here and the various tools and equipment we're playing with, shoot a question in any of the social media or the link down below. I'm very happy to assist you and help in any way I can with an individual problem in private messaging or something that's more public and everybody else can read into. Have a look at all the social medias where I'm posting work and content quite regularly across all the platforms. What appears in video form has been made many months ago, sitting on the computer, slowly edited and released inappropriate, where I'm dribbling out content on a weekly basis. And what I'm currently working on now is, again, not going to be seen for a very long time. Thank you very much for watching. Happy and safe modelling. Practice as much as you can at home. Catch you guys next time. Stay tuned for further content.